lecture in media theory. Today we'll be talking about Plato's Allegory of the Cave. So just to get started, I'll say that this is probably an unusual reading to be assigned in a media theory class, but hopefully now that you've been through the dialogue and you've read it, you might get an idea of why I've assigned this. I assign it ostensibly because it is, in a sense, one of the earliest works of media theory that we have, one of the earliest written accounts of media theory that we have. So to get started, let's talk a little bit about background. So the Allegory of the Cave was written about 380 BCE, so almost 400 years before the birth of Christ. And of course it was written by Plato, who was a Greek philosopher originally from Athens. And Plato famously was the student of Socrates, another Greek philosopher you probably heard about. Now Socrates did many things, including founding the first university in the Grove of Academe, which is where that phrase comes from. And Socrates taught primarily through the use of dialogue. You've probably heard of the Socratic method. And this is where it comes from. This is where that phrase originates. So Socrates would have his students sit and have discussions with them in order to lead them ultimately to truth or to an understanding of the concepts that he was discussing. Now, interestingly, Socrates didn't really write anything down because his method was purely oral. So as a result, we don't know a whole lot about Socrates other than what his students wrote down, and of course Plato was one of his students. Now, there is, of course, a question about whether or not Plato is simply putting his arguments in his teacher's mouth and writing them down, or if Socrates actually said these things. But that's something we won't ever really know. So with that in mind, these are the guys, right? This is Socrates on the left, and this is Plato on the right. So it's, obviously we don't have any pictures, but this gives you a little bit of an idea about who you're dealing with. And this brings us to the Allegory of the Cave itself. So the Allegory of the Cave is part of a larger work, Plato's Republic, in which he delineates what goes into, or his idea, I guess, of what should go into the making of a republic as a state, right? As a nation state, to the extent that such things existed then. And of course, it is an allegory, which comes from the Latin allegoria, which means speaking to imply something else. So, of course, the power of the allegory is similar to the power of the myth in culture, in that it's what we in communication would call an open text. This is a theory that finds its origination with scholars like Umberto Eco, who argued that texts essentially come either in open or closed form. And this, of course, is a continuum. So they could be more open or more closed. It's not one or the other, right? They could be more open or more closed. And an open text is a text that's largely open to the interpretation of the reader. And, of course, open texts, then, are those oftentimes that become our quote-unquote classics. Because people can read them and relate to them in different ways. They can interpret them in different ways and still find a degree of meaning in it. So an allegory is an open text that represents a larger point about society or human nature more broadly, and it does so through a simple story, right? And so that's what we have here in Plato's Allegory of the Cave. So what does this allegory say? Well, of course, if you read it, you understand that we have a bunch of prisoners that are bound up, imprisoned inside a cave. They've never been outside, and they're bound in such a way that they're only able to look straight in front of them. And so behind them, while they're chained up, there are these guards, let's say, that have a fire and are parading a series of different animals or cutouts of animals, cutouts of things that cast shadows on the walls in front of the prisoners. And what Plato's argument here is essentially what he's asking Glaucon about. Glaucon, by the way, was Plato's brother. But what Socrates and Glaucon are discussing is this idea that if the people have been bound in this way, then what's going on is that they believe the shadows they see on the wall to be reality. They have no other exposure to reality, right? They have no other index by which to judge whether or not these images are real, and so, of course, they seem like they're real. So the allegory then asks, what if one of the prisoners escaped, ran out of the cave, and encountered the quote-unquote real world, right? And so Plato, in the guise of Socrates, says, well, what would happen would be that their first exposure to the real world would be painful. We've all experienced coming out of a dark room out into the sun, and how that's painful in a way. And he says, it would be difficult for them to comprehend what they're looking at and to make sense of it, and it would be painful. But eventually, they would learn to see these new things. They would look around, and they would realize that these things are quite different and, in a way, much more real than what they encountered in the cave. And so then Socrates in the allegory says, well, what happens then? I mean, he'd want to go back and tell all his fellow prisoners, like, hey guys, hey, there's all this real world outside, and you're really not seeing anything, right? And he would feel that it was his duty, in a sense, to go back and let his fellow people know, his fellow prisoners, hey, this isn't reality. But then the question becomes, how would the prisoners react? And both Socrates and Glaucon come to the conclusion that they would react by wanting to kill the prisoner who came back in, because obviously they want to avoid this pain of learning and the idea that everything that they know is false. Because there's an anxiety there, right? There's a pain. It's the same pain, in a sense, that the prisoner who escapes experiences when he leaves the cave for the first time and he sees the outside world. They don't want that. So, it's this pain, right? The painful experience of the outside world that ultimately the other prisoners don't want. Indeed, they agree that Socrates and Glaucon agree that the other prisoners would likely kill those who try to free them, as they would not want to leave the safety and comfort of their known world. So, then why did I have you read this? We've gone over the story, we've talked about its history a little bit. Why did I have you read it? Well, in a sense, it should be relatable to you. I see it as clearly relatable to your situation now as students. Many of you may be experiencing a kind of discomfort in your studies, especially at this point. This is a 4,000 level class. Many of you are seniors that are getting ready to graduate, presumably at the end of the academic year. And you might find yourself dealing with a lot of the ideas and theories and so on that you've been exposed to in ways that are hard to experience, right? That are hard to deal with. Moreover, I also had you read this because it's one of the best known or most important stories in the history of Western civilization. It undergirds much of Western philosophy. And I've also had you read it because it's part of a larger Western story or narrative or a series of myths about the dangers of learning and knowledge. And it's important to recognize that this is a big part, a large element in our culture. And it remains so in our culture today, right? In Western culture generally, and in our culture today. And then finally, I had you read it because it applies nicely to the critical appraisal of modern media culture. Excuse me. So let me dig into those thoughts a little bit more. So it should be relatable to your situation. I mean, in a very real sense, leaving your home, going off to college, leaving the relatively small world that many of you have encountered so far, and going into a bigger world is something of a painful experience. I'm not too macho to admit that when I went off to college, I went far away. I grew up in Philadelphia, and I went to college here in Atlanta. And when I got on that plane, I was very anxious. I was scared. Right? It was a painful emotional experience leaving my parents, my sister, my friends, uh, and so in a sense, leaving home is like leaving the cave. And then, of course, you're exposed to all these ideas. All these wild ideas that oftentimes might conflict with the ideas that you're taught at home or taught at church or taught in elementary school or taught in any of the places where the people are that you've been trusting for all these years. And I'm not trying to tell you you shouldn't trust them. I mean, you should. But nevertheless, right, there is a kind of anxiety when you learn that not everyone sees the world the same way, and when you're exposed to novel ideas that make you think in new ways. Indeed, Soren Kierkegaard, the philosopher, called this the dizziness of freedom, right? And you could sort of see that right here in this image, the idea that ultimately when you go to college, you learn that you're free to think about the world in all these different ways. And that ultimately it's up to you to make up your mind. And so this, of course, is a painful experience that brings on Kierkegaard's dizziness of freedom. That's very similar in a sense to the prisoner leaving the cave. And then some of you might go back to the cave for holidays, for the summer, what have you, and encounter resistance from the people that you love and that you care about, your friends, your parents, and so on. When you go back and you try out some of these new ideas on them, and perhaps they don't want to be exposed to these new ideas, right? So this is very much, I think, relatable in that sense. I also have you read it again because it's one of the most important stories in Western civilization. It's a story that we tell again and again in a series of different ways. The Matrix, of course, is an example of this. The Matrix with the red pill or the blue pill and Neo seeing what the world really is ultimately a rehashing of the allegory of the cave, right? He gets out and he sees the world for what it truly is. He's no longer looking at the shadows of the Matrix, right? So this is just one example of how this allegory permeates our culture and is constantly told and retold in different ways. And then, of course, it's also part of a larger Western narrative, or identifies, I think, the essence or the ontology. Ontology is a fancy word for essence. It identifies the ontology of the fear of knowledge and learning that runs throughout Western culture. It goes by a variety of names. We can call it anti-intellectualism. We could call it fear out of ignorance. We could call it a lot of different things. But it is ingrained in us in ways that we probably don't even think about. I mean, in one of the most basic stories in Western civilization, the Adam and Eve story from the book of Genesis, right? We see Adam and Eve who are happy and who walk with God until they eat from the tree of knowledge. And the results of this, of course, are that then humankind is saddled with original sin forever, depending on your faith, what you believe. But they're saddled with original sin, and they're banished from paradise. So what does that allegory tell us? Well, it tells us that learning is scary, that it can literally banish us from paradise, right? Then we have we can even predate that with Greek myth, right? Icarus, who crafted wings out of wax so that he could fly to the sun, right? But then, of course, he flew too close to the sun, and his wings melted, and he tragically fell to earth. Then we can see the same thing with Prometheus in Greek myth. So Prometheus himself was one of the gods, or a demigod, I suppose, and he took fire from the gods, fire representing knowledge, and gave it to man. And what happened to him when he did this, when he shared this knowledge? Well, Zeus says, not so fast, Prometheus, and he chains him to a rock, and because he's an immortal, He lives forever. And this bird comes and eats out his liver every day forever, right? So again, you see the punishment that's associated with knowledge. The Faust parable, which has been retold countless times, is about a learned man, a man of letters, a scholar, who sells his soul to the devil for knowledge, right? And at least in Faust, in Goethe's version of Faust, Faust is at the end carted off to the underworld by the devil. He loses, right? He sells his soul for knowledge, and it dooms him. And then Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's story of science fiction, in a way, right, is ultimately about the dangers of knowledge as well. A scientist, that sort of the archetype of modernity, of the scientific method, and so on, engages in dangerous behavior. It's much like Jurassic Park. You were so interested in whether or not you could do it, you didn't ask whether or not you should. So again, we see this aversion to learning, and an aversion, in part, because it's an aversion to learning and knowledge, it is in part an aversion to communication as well. Because communication is how we exchange this knowledge, right? So there is this deeply ingrained pattern here, and I think that Plato, in telling the allegory of the cave, hits at the essence of all these, right? Which is that dizziness of freedom, that pain that's experienced when one leaves the cave seeking truth, or at least more knowledge. We don't even have to call it truth, but it's painful, and in that sense, it's dangerous, right? I mean, real learning is dangerous. It's not. When I was a kid, the United Negro College Fund had this ad tagline that was "Knowledge was power," right? And in a very real sense, knowledge is power, but it's also dangerous, as are all powerful things, right? It can cause harm. And it's not just in myth that we see these kinds of prejudices, or this kind of anti-intellectualism, or this fear of leaving the cave. It runs through our society so deeply that it's ensconced in our parlance, in our sayings. What you don't know won't hurt you. Curiosity killed the cat. Ignorance is bliss, right? I mean, these are offhand sayings that we toss out there that we don't even really think about or consider. And I suggest to you that many times you can see sort of the essence of a culture, or the essence of underlying cultural threads in the things that become these kinds of trite sayings, right? These words that we just sort of throw out there without really considering, because everyone takes them as truth. So that's something to think about. And then, of course, Plato didn't envision televisions or the movie theater, but you have to admit that the allegory is really a perfect kind of match for how we engage with media today, right? I mean, all of us sitting in the theater, as we see here, staring literally at images flickering on a wall, couldn't get much closer to the idea of the cave and the shadows, right? So it's interesting, how it applies to us today. Now, you might say, well, people don't go to the movies as much anymore. Everybody's streaming. But, I mean, even it's clear that even when we watch TV, as far back as the 1950s, excuse me, as far back as the 1950s, what we're doing is, in a sense, sitting together with our fellow prisoners in the cave, watching these flickering images in front of us, right? And it still applies today, in a sense. Right? I mean, this is, in part, what parents worry about when they tell their kids, oh, get off that computer and get outside, right? Again, it's as if you're in the cave, looking at these images. And there's much talk, again, about things like, we're all engaged in social media on our phones, and many people make a distinction between social media and the real world, right? Again, it's an offhand kind of way of speaking about a communication phenomenon, or a medium, that belies the sort of the importance of it and what it means to us as we participate in these things. It's, as we sit there and we get on social media and we say it's not the real world, I mean, it's as if we're acknowledging that in a sense we're all now just individuals sitting in Plato's cave. It's just that we're all looking at different shadows. Now, I should note, right, that Plato didn't anticipate these mediums by any means. And his argument, his allegory there, had to do in part with his theory of forms and how much of what we see, what we take to be real, is or isn't, right? Um, so he wasn't really talking about media per se, but nevertheless, it's about media to the extent that all experience is mediated experience. We have no way to interact with the outside world other than through our senses. We could taste it, we could feel it, we could see it, we could smell it, we can touch it. But these are the only ways that we can deal with the world, with that quote unquote reality outside of us. And so we're limited in our perception. And because we are limited, this raises the question, are we ever really dealing with truth, with reality? Can we ever really know what a thing is, right? I mean, when we look at something, what we're seeing is light bouncing off that thing. So, based on that, does the thing really look like that? The answer would be no. Our eyes only pick up a certain degree of the electromagnetic spectrum. There are light waves all around us that are moving around all the time that we can't see, but that doesn't mean they aren't there. And so this is, in a sense, what Plato was getting at. But nevertheless, because it's an allegory, and because it's an open text, open to interpretation, we can look at this and say, okay, well, when we engage with Facebook, when we engage with Instagram, with Twitter, with the newspaper, with the TV news, with Netflix series, are we engaging with reality? Right? Are we engaging with the truth? Or are we just looking at shadows? Right? And I think that's an important question, and it's important to keep in mind. There are, of course, no easy answers in media theory. There's no easy answers in any kind of theory. And unfortunately, that's something that we just have to deal with. But it's worthwhile to keep in mind as you engage with media and you engage with the world, you always have to be asking yourself whether or not this is true or real or authentic. All right, that's all I've got for this one. Thanks for hanging with me on the lecture. Have a good one.